How Singapore became richer than 95% of countries. Imagine a tiny island nation with absolutely no natural resources, smaller than New York City, kicked out of a larger federation, surrounded by larger and sometimes hostile neighbors, with no fresh water of its own, no oil, no gas, no minerals worth mining, and a population that was largely poor, uneducated, and divided along ethnic and linguistic lines. Now imagine that this same nation, within a single generation, transforms itself into one of the wealthiest countries on Earth, with a per capita income that rivals and often exceeds that of the United States, Switzerland, and Norway. This isn't a fairy tale or some economic fantasy. This is the real story of Singapore, and it's one of the most remarkable economic transformations in human history. Today, Singapore stands as a gleaming metropolis of nearly 6 million people, with one of the highest standards of living in the world, virtually no corruption, world-class infrastructure, and a per capita GDP that hovers around $90,000. The city-state has become a global financial center, a technology hub, a maritime powerhouse, and a model of efficient governance that countries around the world study and attempt to emulate. But how did this happen? How did a country with literally nothing going for it manage to leapfrog over nations blessed with natural resources, larger populations, and seemingly better starting positions? The answer is a complex tapestry of visionary leadership, pragmatic policies, strategic positioning, cultural adaptation, and some decisions that remain controversial even today. This is the story of how Singapore became richer than 95% of countries on Earth. To understand Singapore's success, we need to go back to where it all began, and frankly, the beginning wasn't promising at all. Singapore's modern history as a British trading post started in 1819 when Sir Stamford Raffles of the British East India Company established a trading settlement on the island. At that time, Singapore was a sleepy fishing village with maybe 1,000 inhabitants, mostly Malay fishermen and some Chinese traders. The British saw potential in its geographic location, situated right at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, at the crossroads of major shipping routes between India, China, and the Indonesian archipelago. This strategic location would prove to be one of Singapore's few natural advantages, but in 1819, it was just a swampy, disease-ridden island that most people would have overlooked. Under British colonial rule, Singapore grew slowly as a port city. The British brought in immigrants, mainly from China and India, to work as laborers, merchants, and administrators. By the early 20th century, Singapore had become a multi-ethnic society with Chinese forming the majority, followed by Malays and Indians, along with smaller communities of Europeans and other groups. This diversity would later become both a challenge and a strength for independent Singapore, but during the colonial period, these different communities largely lived separate lives, speaking different languages, practicing different religions, and maintaining different customs. There was little sense of a unified Singaporean identity because, frankly, there was no such thing as Singapore as a nation. It was just a colonial outpost, a convenient port for the British Empire. The Second World War shattered any illusions about British invincibility and colonial permanence. When Japanese forces invaded Malaya and Singapore in 1942, the British defenses collapsed far more quickly than anyone expected. Singapore, which the British had called their Gibraltar of the East, and believed to be an impregnable fortress, fell in just a week of fighting. The Japanese occupation that followed was brutal, particularly for the Chinese population, who suffered massacres, forced labor, and systematic persecution. The occupation lasted 3.5 years, and it left deep scars on Singaporean society. But it also awakened a sense that the colonial order was not eternal, that independence was possible, and that Singaporeans would need to take charge of their own destiny. After the war ended in 1945, the British returned, but the world had changed. The age of empire was ending, and nationalist movements were surging across Asia and Africa. In Singapore, political consciousness was growing, particularly among the English-educated middle class and the Chinese-educated working class. Various political parties emerged, advocating for self-governance and eventually independence. Among the young politicians who emerged during this period was a Cambridge-educated lawyer named Lee Kuan Yew, who would become the central figure in Singapore's transformation. Lee and his colleagues founded the People's Action Party in 1954, a political movement that brought together English-educated professionals, Chinese-educated workers, and trade unionists in a broad coalition pushing for independence and social reform. Singapore achieved self-governance from Britain in 1959, with Lee Kuan Yew becoming the first prime minister, a position he would hold for the next 31 years. But Singapore wasn't yet fully independent. The political consensus at the time was that Singapore was too small to survive on its own, so the plan was to merge with Malaya and form a larger federation. This merger happened in 1963, creating the Federation of Malaysia, which included Malaya, Singapore, and the Borneo territories of Sabah and Sarawak. The marriage was troubled from the start. Political tensions emerged between Singapore's leaders and the federal government in Kuala Lumpur, particularly over issues of racial politics and economic policy. Singapore's leadership advocated for a Malaysian Malaysia, where all races would be equal, while Malay politicians in Kuala Lumpur pursued policies that privileged the Malay majority. These tensions escalated to the point where riots broke out, and the situation became untenable. On August 9, 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia. It's worth pausing to appreciate how unusual this was. Countries usually fight for independence, they don't get kicked out. But Singapore was forced to become independent, and the separation came as a shock to many Singaporeans, including Lee Kuan Yew himself, who famously cried during the press conference announcing the separation. Singapore was now a fully independent nation, but the circumstances were hardly ideal. The country had no natural resources, no significant military to defend itself, a population of less than 2 million people, high unemployment, inadequate housing, ethnic tensions that had recently exploded into violence, and an economy that had been oriented towards serving the larger Malaysian market. Many observers at the time gave Singapore little chance of survival. Even Lee Kuan Yew later admitted that he thought they might last 10 years at best before being forced to merge with someone, whether Malaysia or Indonesia. This unpromising beginning is crucial to understanding Singapore's subsequent success because it meant that the country's leaders knew they had no margin for error, no natural advantages to fall back on, and no choice but to make the most rational, pragmatic, and effective decisions possible. As Lee Kuan Yew put it, Singapore had to be more competent, more efficient, more productive, and more united than its neighbors, or it simply wouldn't survive. This existential pressure shaped everything that followed. The government couldn't afford to be corrupt because resources were too scarce. It couldn't afford to be inefficient because competition was too fierce. It couldn't afford ethnic conflict because the society was too fragile. Every policy had to work, or the consequences could be catastrophic. This sense of existential vulnerability became baked into Singapore's political culture and continues to influence decision-making even today when the country is wealthy and secure. So what did Singapore actually do? How did the leadership transform this unpromising situation into one of the world's great success stories? The transformation rested on several pillars, each reinforcing the others, creating a system that was greater than the sum of its parts. Let's explore each of these pillars in detail, because the story of Singapore's rise is really the story of how these different elements came together. The first and perhaps most fundamental pillar was visionary and pragmatic leadership. Lee Kuan Yew and his team at the People's Action Party were not ideologues wedded to any particular economic theory. They were intensely pragmatic, willing to try whatever worked and abandon what didn't. In the 1950s and 60s, much of the developing world was embracing socialism, central planning, and import substitution industrialization. Many newly independent countries nationalized foreign companies, erected high-tariff walls, and attempted to develop complete domestic industries to replace imports. Singapore's leaders looked at these policies and decided they wouldn't work for a tiny city-state with no natural resources and no domestic market. Instead, they chose a radically different path that was almost heretical at the time. They would embrace free trade, welcome foreign investment, and integrate Singapore into the global economy as deeply as possible. This wasn't an easy sell. Many Singaporeans, particularly in the trade unions and among the Chinese-educated population, were suspicious of foreign capital and Western companies. There was a strong anti-colonial sentiment and a desire to build a self-reliant economy. But Lee Kuan Yew and his economic team, which included brilliant technocrats like Keng Swee, understood that Singapore simply didn't have the luxury of economic nationalism. The country needed jobs, technology, foreign exchange, and knowledge, and the fastest way to get these was to attract multinational corporations. So Singapore set out to make itself the most attractive destination in Asia for foreign investment, offering political stability, rule of law, infrastructure, tax incentives, and a government that genuinely wanted businesses to succeed. In 1961, even before full independence, the government established the Economic Development Board, tasked with attracting foreign investment and promoting industrialization. The EDB became one of the most effective economic development agencies in the world, actively courting multinational corporations, identifying promising industries, and coordinating between government agencies to solve whatever problems investors faced. If a company wanted to set up a factory in Singapore and needed trained workers, the government would set up training programs. If they needed specific infrastructure, the government would build it. If they needed certain regulatory approvals, the EDB would help navigate the bureaucracy. This level of responsiveness and competence was almost unheard of in the developing world at the time, and it gave Singapore a significant competitive advantage. The initial focus was on labor-intensive manufacturing because Singapore had a large pool of unemployed and underemployed workers who needed jobs. The government attracted textile factories, electronics assembly plants, and other industries that could absorb large numbers of workers. Foreign companies, particularly from the United States, Japan, and Europe, found Singapore attractive not just because of the incentives but because of the overall business environment. Unlike many developing countries where corruption was rampant, regulations were arbitrary, and contracts were unreliable, Singapore offered genuine rule of law. If you had a business dispute, you could take it to court and expect a fair hearing. If you signed a contract with the government, it would be honored. If government officials made promises, they followed through. This reliability was worth more than any tax incentive because it reduced risk and uncertainty. As Singapore industrialized through the late 1960s and 1970s, the government constantly upgraded the economy, moving from labor-intensive industries to more capital-intensive and skill-intensive sectors. When wages started rising and labor-intensive manufacturing became uncompetitive, instead of trying to hold on to these industries through protectionism, Singapore deliberately encouraged them to relocate to cheaper countries while moving up the value chain. The government promoted electronics, precision engineering, petrochemicals, and pharmaceuticals. Later, it pushed into services like finance, logistics, and information technology. This constant upgrading required close cooperation between government and business, with the government anticipating future trends and preparing the workforce and infrastructure accordingly. This brings us to the second major pillar of Singapore's success: massive investment in education and human capital development. Lee Kuan Yew and his colleagues understood from the beginning that Singapore's only real resource was its people. The country had no oil, no minerals, no fertile land for agriculture. If Singapore was going to compete, it needed a workforce that was more skilled, more disciplined, and more productive than those of its neighbors. This meant transforming an educational system that, at independence, left many children with only a few years of schooling and taught in multiple languages that weren't economically useful internationally. The government made education a top priority, investing heavily in schools, universities, and technical training. School attendance was made compulsory, and the government ensured that there were enough places for all children. The quality of education was constantly upgraded, with teachers receiving extensive training and competitive salaries. The curriculum was designed with economic needs in mind, emphasizing mathematics, science, and technical skills. English was made the medium of instruction in all schools, a controversial decision that upset some in the Chinese and Malay communities who wanted education in their mother tongues, but one that proved crucial for Singapore's integration into the global economy. English gave Singaporeans access to international knowledge, made it easy for multinational corporations to operate in Singapore, and allowed Singapore to serve as a bridge between East and West. Beyond basic education, Singapore invested heavily in technical and vocational training. The government established numerous polytechnics and institutes of technical education, providing pathways for students who weren't academically inclined but could excel in technical fields. The training was closely coordinated with industry needs, so students learned skills that employers actually wanted. The government also sent thousands of students abroad on scholarships to top universities, particularly in the United States and United Kingdom, on the condition that they return to serve Singapore for several years. Many of these scholars went on to become top civil servants, business leaders, and professionals, bringing back knowledge and connections that benefited the entire country. The education system was meritocratic, at least in theory. Students were rigorously tested and streamed according to ability, with the best students channeled toward university and the rest toward polytechnics or technical institutes. This meritocracy extended to the civil service and government, where positions were supposed to go to the most capable candidates regardless of ethnicity or family background. The government paid civil servants very well, with top officials earning salaries comparable to or exceeding those in the private sector. The rationale was that high salaries would attract the best talent to public service and reduce the temptation for corruption. This approach largely worked, creating a civil service that was genuinely competent and relatively clean, though critics argued that the system also created an entitled elite disconnected from ordinary citizens. The third pillar was the government's approach to housing and urban development, which deserves special attention because it was both remarkably successful and quite unique. At independence, Singapore faced a severe housing crisis. A large portion of the population lived in slums, squatter settlements, and overcrowded shop houses with inadequate sanitation and frequent fires. Housing was not just a social problem but also an economic and political one. Poor living conditions bred disease, unrest, and communist sympathies. The government needed to house the population, but it also saw housing as a tool for creating a stable, property-owning middle class with a stake in the country's success. The solution was the Housing and Development Board, established in 1960, which embarked on one of the most ambitious public housing programs in history. The HDB built hundreds of thousands of apartment units in new towns across the island, providing modern housing with electricity, running water, and sanitation. What made this different from public housing in many other countries was that the apartments weren't just for rent, they were for sale. The government wanted Singaporeans to own their homes, believing that property ownership would create social stability and a sense of belonging. To make this possible for ordinary workers, the government used the Central Provident Fund, a mandatory savings scheme where both employers and employees contributed a percentage of wages. Workers could use their CPF savings to buy HDB apartments, effectively allowing them to purchase homes with their own savings rather than relying on banks or government subsidies. This policy was brilliantly effective on multiple levels. It solved the housing crisis, giving most Singaporeans decent homes within a generation. It created a property-owning society where the majority of citizens had a significant financial stake in the country's stability and prosperity. It forced Singaporeans to save a substantial portion of their income, creating a high savings rate that funded investment and cushioned against economic shocks. And it gave the government a powerful tool for social engineering. The HDB estates were ethnically integrated, with quotas ensuring that no estate became dominated by any single ethnic group. This forced different communities to live together, use the same facilities, and interact daily, helping to break down ethnic barriers and create a shared Singaporean identity. Whether this level of government control over where people lived was appropriate is debatable, but it undeniably helped prevent the kind of ethnic segregation and tension that plagued many other multi-ethnic societies. The government's urban planning extended beyond housing. Singapore was transformed from a chaotic, polluted port city into one of the most carefully planned and managed urban environments in the world. The government acquired land extensively, sometimes controversially, giving it control over development. This allowed coordinated planning of residential areas, industrial parks, commercial districts, and green spaces. The city was designed for efficiency, with industrial areas located near the port, residential areas connected by mass transit, and commercial centers strategically placed. The government invested heavily in infrastructure, building roads, expressways, the MRT subway system, and one of the world's best airports. Every aspect of the urban environment was managed, from the height of buildings to the types of businesses allowed in different areas to the amount of green space required. This brings us to the fourth pillar: strategic use of geography and development of Singapore as a maritime and logistics hub. Singapore's location at the crossroads of major shipping routes was one of its few natural advantages, and the government exploited this to the fullest. The Port of Singapore Authority, later corporatized as PSA, was tasked with making Singapore the premier port in Asia. The government invested heavily in port facilities, dredging the harbor, building container terminals, and constantly upgrading technology. Port operations were streamlined and made highly efficient, with fast turnaround times that saved shipping companies money. The government also ensured that the port never closed, operating 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and that labor disputes never disrupted operations. Singapore's port became the busiest in the world by various metrics, handling enormous volumes of cargo and serving as a transshipment hub where cargo from larger ships was transferred to smaller vessels for distribution around the region. This generated jobs, not just for dock workers but for logistics companies, freight forwarders, insurance companies, and all the supporting services. The port also attracted industries that depended on maritime trade, particularly petrochemical refining. Singapore became one of the world's largest refining centers, importing crude oil, refining it, and exporting petroleum products. This required massive investment in infrastructure and technology, but it created high-value jobs and integrated Singapore even more deeply into global trade networks. The airport received similar attention. Changi Airport, which opened in 1981, was designed to be the best airport in the world, and by most measures, it succeeded. The airport was efficient, comfortable, constantly upgraded, and served as a major hub connecting Asia, Europe, and Australia. Singapore Airlines, the national carrier, was built into one of the world's premier airlines, known for service quality and operational excellence. The airline and airport reinforced each other, with Changi serving as Singapore Airlines hub and the airline bringing passengers and cargo through Changi. Together, they made Singapore a crucial node in global aviation networks, bringing both economic benefits and soft power. The fifth pillar was Singapore's development as a financial center, which transformed the city-state into one of the world's key financial hubs alongside New York, London, Hong Kong, and Tokyo. This didn't happen by accident. In the late 1960s, the government identified financial services as a strategic sector and set out to build the necessary infrastructure, regulations, and expertise. Singapore established itself as the center for the Asian dollar market, attracting banks to hold and trade US dollars outside American regulatory jurisdiction, similar to what London had done with the eurodollar market. The Monetary Authority of Singapore was created in 1971 to regulate the financial sector while also promoting Singapore as a financial center, balancing stability with growth. The government created a regulatory environment that was strict enough to maintain confidence and prevent major scandals but flexible enough to allow innovation. Singapore attracted global banks, insurance companies, asset managers, and other financial institutions by offering political stability, rule of law, skilled workforce, good infrastructure, and favorable tax treatment. The financial sector grew to become a major pillar of the economy, employing tens of thousands of people in high-paying jobs and generating substantial tax revenue. Singapore became a key center for wealth management, attracting wealthy individuals from across Asia and beyond who wanted a safe, stable place to park their money. The city-state also developed expertise in specialized areas like trade finance, insurance, and more recently fintech. The sixth pillar was trade policy and international engagement. From the beginning, Singapore was committed to free trade, both out of necessity and conviction. The government understood that as a tiny country dependent on imports for food, water, energy, and raw materials, protectionism would be suicidal. Singapore needed access to foreign markets to sell its goods and services, and it needed efficient access to imports to keep costs low. The country became a founding member of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and used this platform to promote regional cooperation and economic integration. Singapore pushed for the ASEAN Free Trade Area and later for broader free trade agreements with partners around the world. Singapore has free trade agreements with dozens of countries, including the United States, China, Japan, India, and the European Union, giving its businesses preferential access to markets covering billions of consumers. The country is also a strong supporter of multilateral institutions like the World Trade Organization and has positioned itself as a champion of the rules-based international order. This stance reflects both ideological commitment and self-interest. As a small country, Singapore benefits from a world where rules matter more than power, where disputes are resolved through institutions rather than force, and where trade flows freely across borders. Singapore's diplomatic efforts have been remarkably successful for such a small country, giving it influence far beyond what its size would suggest. The seventh pillar was governance, particularly the fight against corruption and the establishment of effective institutions. When Singapore became independent, corruption was widespread, as it was in most developing countries. Lee Kuan Yew and his government made anti-corruption a top priority, not just for moral reasons but because they understood that corruption would undermine everything else they were trying to achieve. Investors wouldn't come if they had to pay bribes. The economy wouldn't be efficient if contracts went to cronies rather than the most qualified bidders. Citizens wouldn't trust the government if officials were lining their pockets. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau was given extensive powers to investigate corruption at all levels of government and society. The agency reported directly to the Prime Minister and was protected from political interference. Penalties for corruption were severe, including long prison sentences and asset confiscation. Perhaps more importantly, the government paid civil servants and political leaders very well, reducing the temptation and the excuse for corruption. Ministers' salaries were pegged to top private sector earnings, making Singapore's political leaders among the highest paid in the world. This was controversial and struck many as excessive, but the government argued it was necessary to attract talent and prevent corruption. The anti-corruption efforts were credible because they targeted high-level officials, not just low-level bureaucrats. Several ministers and senior officials were prosecuted and jailed for corruption over the years, sending a clear message that no one was above the law. The results were remarkable. Singapore consistently ranks as one of the least corrupt countries in the world, comparable to the Nordic countries and well ahead of most other Asian nations. This reputation for clean governance became a major competitive advantage, attracting investment, talent, and trust. Beyond anti-corruption, Singapore built effective institutions across all areas of government. The civil service was professionalized, with recruitment and promotion based on merit rather than patronage. Government agencies were given clear mandates and held accountable for results. There was extensive use of data and evidence in policymaking, with policies regularly reviewed and adjusted based on outcomes. Statutory boards were created to manage specific functions like housing, port operations, and economic development, giving them operational autonomy while maintaining accountability. This institutional effectiveness allowed Singapore to implement policies much more successfully than many other countries with similar ideas but weaker execution. The eighth pillar was social policy and the creation of a cohesive multi-ethnic society. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect of Singapore's development because the country was deeply divided along ethnic and linguistic lines. The Chinese majority was itself divided between different dialect groups. The Malay and Indian minorities had their own internal divisions. There was a real risk that these divisions could tear the country apart, especially given the ethnic riots that had occurred in the 1960s and the tensions with Malaysia. The government's approach was to acknowledge ethnic diversity while insisting on a shared Singaporean identity that transcended ethnicity. English was made the common language, allowing all groups to communicate. The educational system brought children from different backgrounds together in the same schools. National service, compulsory military service for all male citizens, mixed young men from different ethnic groups, forcing them to work together and building shared experiences. The HDB housing policy ensured ethnic integration at the neighborhood level. At the same time, the government was careful to respect each community's language, religion, and culture. Singapore has 4 official languages: English, Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil. Students learn English plus their mother tongue. Religious freedom is guaranteed, and different communities' festivals are public holidays. The government also made sure that all ethnic groups felt they had a stake in the system. The elected presidency and group representation constituencies were designed to ensure minority representation. Government scholarships and opportunities were distributed across all ethnic groups. Meritocracy was emphasized as the governing principle, with success based on ability rather than ethnicity. This approach wasn't perfect and attracted criticism from various quarters. Some felt the government was too heavy-handed in managing ethnic relations, suppressing genuine expression of ethnic identity. Others felt that the meritocratic system actually disadvantaged Malays and Indians who started from lower socioeconomic positions. But by and large, the approach succeeded in creating a relatively harmonious multi-ethnic society, something that many other diverse countries have struggled to achieve. The ninth pillar was industrial policy and economic diversification. While Singapore embraced free markets and foreign investment, the government was not laissez-faire in the pure sense. It actively shaped the economy's development through strategic interventions. Government-linked companies played a major role in key sectors, from telecommunications to shipping to banking. These GLCs were run commercially and competed in the market, but they gave the government influence over strategic sectors and generated returns that funded further development. Temasek Holdings and GIC, Singapore's sovereign wealth funds, invested both domestically and internationally, building up massive reserves that provided economic security and generated substantial returns. The government identified strategic sectors and actively promoted them through incentives, infrastructure, training programs, and research support. In the 1970s and 80s, the focus was on moving from light manufacturing to heavy industry and electronics. In the 1990s and 2000s, the emphasis shifted to services, knowledge industries, and innovation. The government invested heavily in research and development, establishing research institutes, funding university research, and attracting international research centers to locate in Singapore. Biopolis and Fusionopolis were built as clusters for biomedical sciences and physical sciences respectively, bringing together research institutes, companies, and startups in a single location to promote collaboration and innovation. This industrial policy was flexible and pragmatic. When certain initiatives didn't work, they were abandoned. When new opportunities emerged, the government moved quickly to capitalize on them. For example, when Singapore saw the rise of gaming and entertainment as economic sectors, it reversed its long-standing opposition to casinos and built 2 integrated resorts with casinos, hotels, shopping, and entertainment facilities. This was controversial among socially conservative segments of Singaporean society, but the government decided the economic benefits outweighed the social costs, provided there were safeguards to prevent problem gambling among locals. The 10th pillar was environmental sustainability and quality of life, which might seem like a luxury for a developing country but which Singapore's leaders recognized as essential for long-term success. Singapore needed to attract and retain talent, both local and foreign, and people wouldn't want to live in a polluted, unpleasant environment no matter how good the economic opportunities. The government invested heavily in sanitation, clean water, and waste management. The Singapore River, which had been an open sewer in the 1960s, was cleaned up and transformed into a scenic waterfront. Despite being one of the most densely populated countries on Earth, Singapore maintained substantial green space, with parks, nature reserves, and trees lining almost every street. The government even trademarked the phrase, "city in a garden," to capture this vision. Water deserves special mention because Singapore's water security was always tenuous. The country depended on Malaysia for much of its water supply, a vulnerability that Malaysia occasionally threatened to exploit. Singapore invested massively in water infrastructure, including catchment systems to capture rainwater, desalination plants to convert seawater into drinking water, and any water facilities that recycle wastewater into ultra-clean water suitable for drinking and industrial use. These investments were expensive but made Singapore self-sufficient in water, eliminating a critical vulnerability. The water story exemplifies Singapore's approach to challenges: identify the problem, invest in solutions, use technology and expertise, and don't accept vulnerability. The 11th pillar was technological adoption and digital transformation. Singapore has consistently been an early and enthusiastic adopter of new technologies, seeing them as ways to overcome the constraints of small size and limited resources. The government computerized early, established one of the world's first nationwide broadband networks, and promoted IT literacy. In recent years, Singapore has pushed into artificial intelligence, smart city technologies, and digital government services. The Smart Nation initiative aims to use technology and data to improve everything from transportation to healthcare to urban planning. Government services are increasingly digital, with citizens able to handle most interactions with government online or through mobile apps. This technological enthusiasm extends to economic policy. Singapore has promoted itself as a fintech hub, creating regulatory sandboxes where companies can test innovations with appropriate oversight. The country has been relatively open to cryptocurrency and blockchain technologies, though with appropriate regulation. The government sees technology not just as a sector to promote but as a tool to maintain competitiveness. As labor costs rise and the population ages, technology and automation become essential to maintaining productivity growth. The 12th pillar was fiscal prudence and long-term planning. Singapore's government has consistently run budget surpluses or small deficits, avoiding the large debts that burden many countries. Tax rates have been kept relatively low, particularly for corporations, but the tax base is broad and collection is efficient. The government has also generated revenue from land sales, government-linked companies, and investment returns. This fiscal strength gives Singapore resilience against economic shocks and credibility with investors. Perhaps more importantly, Singapore's leadership has consistently thought long-term, making investments and decisions that might not pay off for decades. The decision to invest in education in the 1960s and 70s took a generation to fully pay off but transformed Singapore's human capital. The investment in Changi Airport was massive and risky but established Singapore as a transportation hub. The water infrastructure investments took decades but ensured security. This long-term orientation contrasts with many democracies where politicians focus on the next election cycle. Singapore's political system, dominated by a single party that has held power continuously since independence, allowed for this long-term thinking, though critics argue it came at the cost of democratic accountability. The 13th pillar was adaptability and willingness to learn from others. Singapore's leadership was never ideological in the sense of being committed to a particular economic model regardless of results. They were willing to learn from anyone and adopt any policy that worked, regardless of where it came from. They studied Japan's industrial policy, Germany's technical education system, Israel's water management, American financial regulation, and British legal systems. Singapore sent officials around the world to study best practices and brought in foreign experts to advise on various issues. This openness to learning and adapting gave Singapore access to the best ideas from around the world. At the same time, Singapore was willing to experiment and innovate rather than just copying others. The HDB housing model was unique to Singapore. The Central Provident Fund system, though inspired by other social security systems, was adapted to Singapore's specific circumstances. The industrial policy approach combined elements from various countries but in a uniquely Singaporean way. This combination of learning from others and adapting to local circumstances allowed Singapore to avoid many mistakes that other developing countries made while finding solutions that worked for its specific context. The 14th pillar was the management of foreign relations and security. As a tiny country surrounded by larger neighbors, Singapore has always been vulnerable. The government has managed this vulnerability through several strategies. First, it maintains a strong military that is highly professional, well-equipped, and capable of defending the island. Military spending is substantial, and national service ensures a large pool of trained reservists. The military serves as a deterrent, making any potential aggressor think twice about the costs of attacking Singapore. Second, Singapore has cultivated strong relationships with major powers, particularly the United States. Singapore allows the U.S. military to use its facilities, making the city-state strategically valuable to America. This relationship provides an implicit security guarantee while also giving Singapore access to American technology and markets. At the same time, Singapore has been careful not to align too closely with any single power, maintaining good relations with China, India, Japan, Europe, and others. This balanced approach allows Singapore to benefit from relationships with multiple partners while avoiding being caught in great power conflicts. Third, Singapore has invested heavily in diplomacy and soft power. For a small country, Singapore has an outsized diplomatic presence and influence. It hosts major international meetings, contributes to UN peacekeeping, and positions itself as a neutral, competent mediator. Singapore's diplomats are well regarded, and the country often serves as a venue for sensitive negotiations, like the Trump-Kim summit in 2018. This diplomatic activism raises Singapore's profile and creates relationships that enhance security and economic opportunities. Now, we need to talk about the person who was at the center of all this, Lee Kuan Yew. Any discussion of Singapore's success has to grapple with Lee's role because he was the dominant political figure for over 30 years and remained influential until his death in 2015. Lee was a complex and controversial figure. He was undoubtedly brilliant, strategic, and deeply committed to Singapore's success. He was also authoritarian, intolerant of dissent, and willing to use harsh measures against opponents. Understanding Singapore requires understanding both Lee's achievements and the costs of his methods. Lee came from a Chinese family in colonial Singapore, received an English education, and studied law at Cambridge. He returned to Singapore as a young lawyer and entered politics in the 1950s, co-founding the People's Action Party. As Prime Minister from 1959 to 1990, Lee dominated Singapore's political life. He was the chief architect of virtually every major policy, from economic strategy to housing to education to foreign relations. His vision shaped Singapore's development, and his political skills kept the PP in power through every election. Lee's governing philosophy combined several elements. He believed in meritocracy, that positions should go to the most capable regardless of background. He believed in pragmatism, that policies should be judged by results rather than ideology. He believed in discipline, that society needed order and rules to function properly. He believed in Asian values, arguing that Asian societies had different cultural traditions from the West and that Western-style liberal democracy wasn't appropriate for Singapore. And he believed in strong government, that the state needed to actively shape society rather than just maintaining order and letting society evolve on its own. These beliefs led to policies that were often effective but also controversial. Lee's government used defamation lawsuits to bankrupt political opponents, particularly those who criticized the PP in ways the government deemed unfair. Opposition politicians and critics often found themselves sued for defamation, facing massive damage awards that destroyed them financially. The government also used preventive detention laws inherited from the colonial era to jail political opponents without trial, particularly in the early years. Trade unions that were too militant were suppressed. The press was brought under control, with newspapers and media outlets either government-linked or careful not to cross certain lines. These methods ensured political stability and allowed the government to implement policies without obstruction, but they also created a political system with limited space for dissent, opposition, or alternative views. Elections were held regularly, but the PP won overwhelming majorities every time through a combination of genuine popular support, effective governance, control of media and institutions, and various mechanisms that made it difficult for opposition parties to compete on a level playing field. Opposition politicians who did get elected often faced intense scrutiny, lawsuits, and other pressures. Lee justified these methods by arguing that Singapore's survival required unity, discipline, and effective government, and that Western-style liberal democracy with its confrontational politics, powerful opposition, and free-for-all media would lead to chaos and failure. He pointed to the problems of many Western democracies, from political gridlock to ethnic tensions to economic mismanagement, and argued that Singapore's system, while less free, delivered better results for ordinary citizens. This argument resonated with many Singaporeans who valued stability, prosperity, and effective governance over political freedom, and were willing to accept constraints on civil liberties in exchange for economic success. Critics, both in Singapore and internationally, argued that this was a false choice, that Singapore could have achieved economic success while maintaining greater political freedom. They pointed to other countries that combined democracy and development, from Japan to South Korea to Taiwan. They argued that the restrictions on political freedom weren't necessary for development, but rather served to keep the PP in power. They also pointed out that while Singapore's government was generally effective, the lack of opposition and accountability created blind spots, encouraged groupthink, and prevented the kind of vigorous debate that might have avoided some policy mistakes. This debate about the Singapore model continues today. Some countries, particularly in the developing world, look at Singapore and see a model worth emulating, believing that strong, technocratic government can deliver development more effectively than messy democracy. Others see Singapore as a cautionary tale, a country that achieved prosperity at the cost of freedom and created a system that, while effective, is fundamentally authoritarian. The truth is probably more complex. Singapore's development required the specific combination of circumstances, leadership, and policies that emerged in the 1960s and 70s. Some elements are transferable to other countries, others are not. Some of the authoritarian measures were probably unnecessary for development, while others may have been crucial given Singapore's specific vulnerabilities. Lee stepped down as Prime Minister in 1990, though he remained in the cabinet as Senior Minister and later Minister-Mentor, continuing to influence policy until 2011. His son, Lee Hsien Loong, became Prime Minister in 2004 and still holds the position today. This succession raised questions about dynasty and democracy, but the younger Lee was genuinely qualified, having served in senior positions and proven his competence. The transition also demonstrated that Singapore's system wasn't entirely dependent on the founding father, that institutions were strong enough to continue functioning with new leadership. Since Lee Kuan Yew's departure from frontline politics, and especially since his death in 2015, Singapore has gradually evolved. The political system has opened up somewhat, with opposition parties winning more seats in parliament, and the government accepting more public discussion and debate. Social media has created spaces for criticism and alternative views that didn't exist in the past. The government has had to adapt to a more educated, cosmopolitan population that wants greater participation in decision-making. At the same time, the fundamental features of the system remain PEP dominance, effective bureaucracy, strategic economic management, and limits on political opposition. Let's talk about some specific challenges Singapore has faced and how it has dealt with them, because the story of Singapore's success isn't just about getting things right but also about managing problems and adapting to changing circumstances. One major challenge has been the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. Singapore, as a small, open economy heavily dependent on trade and financial services, was hit hard. GDP contracted sharply, unemployment rose, and the stock market plunged. The government responded with aggressive fiscal stimulus, using its accumulated reserves to support the economy. It subsidized wages to prevent layoffs, invested in infrastructure, and provided support to affected industries. The economy recovered relatively quickly, demonstrating the value of the fiscal prudence that had built up reserves for exactly this kind of emergency. Another challenge has been demographic change. Singapore's birth rate has fallen to one of the lowest in the world, well below replacement level. This creates a time bomb of aging population, shrinking workforce, and rising healthcare and pension costs. The government has tried various policies to encourage higher birth rates, from baby bonuses to extended maternity leave to subsidized childcare, but with limited success. Young Singaporeans, facing high costs of living, competitive work environments, and changing social attitudes, are choosing to have fewer children or no children at all. This has forced Singapore to rely heavily on immigration to maintain workforce size and economic growth. Immigration has become one of the most contentious issues in Singapore. The country has brought in large numbers of foreign workers, from highly skilled professionals to low-wage workers in construction and domestic service. By some estimates, foreigners make up over 40% of Singapore's population. This has created significant social tensions. Many Singaporeans feel that foreigners are competing for jobs, driving up housing costs, crowding public transportation, and diluting Singaporean identity. There have been complaints about employers favoring cheaper foreign workers over Singaporeans. The government has tried to balance economic needs with social cohesion, tightening immigration policies, imposing quotas and levies on foreign workers, and emphasizing Singaporean identity. Income inequality has also emerged as a challenge. While Singapore has achieved high average incomes, the distribution is quite unequal, with a Gini coefficient among the highest of developed countries. The top earners, particularly in finance and business, make enormous incomes, while lower-wage workers struggle with high costs of living. The government has responded with various measures: progressive taxation, more subsidies for lower-income families, workfare supplements for low-wage workers, and increased spending on healthcare and education. But the fundamental tension remains between Singapore's free market orientation and the desire for greater equality. Singapore also faces the challenge of transitioning from being innovation adopters to innovation creators. For much of its development, Singapore succeeded by implementing others' innovations efficiently, bringing in foreign technology and expertise, and executing better than competitors. But as the country has reached the technological frontier in many areas, further progress requires generating innovation domestically. This is culturally challenging because the education system that served Singapore well in the past, with its emphasis on discipline, exams, and correct answers, may not foster the creativity, risk-taking, and independent thinking that innovation requires. The government has recognized this and attempted to reform education to encourage more creativity and entrepreneurship, with mixed results. The tension between maintaining the discipline and rigor that drove past success and fostering the creativity needed for future success is ongoing. There's also the fundamental question of political evolution. As Singapore has become wealthier and more educated, with a population that is globally connected and exposed to ideas from around the world, pressures for greater political participation and freedom have grown. Younger Singaporeans, who didn't experience the struggles of the early years, are less willing to accept restrictions on freedom in exchange for prosperity. They take prosperity for granted and want more voice in how their society is run. The government has tried to respond by consulting more widely, allowing more debate, and loosening some restrictions, but without fundamentally changing the system. Whether this gradualist approach will satisfy demands for change or whether pressure will build for more fundamental political reform remains to be seen. Climate change and environmental challenges pose long-term threats. As a low-lying island nation, Singapore is vulnerable to sea level rise and extreme weather. The government has invested in coastal defenses and drainage systems and is planning for further adaptation. Water security remains an ongoing concern despite the investments in desalination and recycling. Singapore is also trying to transition to a more sustainable economy, promoting clean energy, green buildings, and sustainable practices, though as a country without significant renewable energy resources, this is challenging. Geopolitical changes create both opportunities and risks. The rise of China and the relative decline of American dominance in Asia puts Singapore in a delicate position. Singapore has tried to maintain good relations with both powers while avoiding having to choose between them. This balancing act has become more difficult as US-China tensions have increased. Singapore values its relationship with the United States and shares concerns about Chinese assertiveness, but it also has substantial economic ties with China and a majority ethnic Chinese population. Managing these competing pressures requires diplomatic skill and could become more challenging if the great power competition intensifies. Technological change, while creating opportunities, also poses challenges. Automation and AI could displace many jobs, particularly in sectors like manufacturing and services where Singapore has concentrated. The transition to a digital economy requires constant reskilling and adaptation. Cybersecurity threats have grown as Singapore becomes more digitized. The government has tried to stay ahead of these challenges through investment in education, digital infrastructure, and cybersecurity, but technology evolves so rapidly that keeping up requires constant effort and resources. Despite these challenges, Singapore today remains one of the world's great success stories. The numbers speak for themselves. Per capita GDP is among the world's highest, above $80,000 in purchasing power parity terms. Unemployment is minimal. The port is the world's busiest by several measures. Changi Airport consistently ranks as the best in the world. The city has world-class healthcare with excellent outcomes and high life expectancy. Education results, as measured by international tests, are at the very top globally. Infrastructure is superb. Crime rates are very low. Corruption is minimal. The government is effective and efficient. But beyond the numbers, Singapore has achieved something perhaps even more remarkable. It has created a nation. Remember that in 1965, there was no Singaporean identity. The island's residents thought of themselves as Chinese, Malay, Indian, or various other identities, but not as Singaporeans. Today, while ethnic identities remain, there is a genuine sense of Singaporean identity, particularly among younger generations who have grown up in independent Singapore. They speak Singlish, a unique local patois that mixes English with Chinese, Malay, and Tamil words. They share common experiences of national service, HDB estates, hawker centers, and common cultural references. They feel proud of Singapore's achievements and defensive when foreigners criticize their country. This creation of national identity in a diverse, immigrant society with no common ethnicity, language, or religion is an achievement that shouldn't be underestimated. Singapore's success has lessons for other countries, though with important caveats. The first lesson is that geography isn't destiny. Singapore succeeded despite having no natural resources and a difficult geographic and political situation. Countries that are resource-rich but poor need to ask themselves why. The second lesson is the importance of effective governance and institutions. Singapore shows that government competence, low corruption, rule of law, and strategic planning can drive development. The third lesson is the value of investing in people. Singapore's massive investment in education, training, and human capital was crucial to its success. The fourth lesson is the importance of openness. Singapore thrived by embracing global trade and investment rather than retreating into protectionism. However, Singapore's model isn't easily transferable. Singapore is a city-state, which makes governance and coordination much easier than in a large country with diverse regions. Singapore had visionary and competent leadership at a crucial moment, something that can't be manufactured. Singapore had a strategic location that it exploited effectively, an advantage not every country has. Singapore's small size and vulnerability created an existential pressure that focused minds and reduced tolerance for mistakes or corruption, a pressure that larger, more secure countries don't face. And Singapore's political model, with its restrictions on freedom and opposition, raises questions about whether the trade-offs are worth it or necessary. Perhaps the most important lesson is that development requires a comprehensive approach. Singapore didn't succeed because of any single policy but because of how different policies reinforced each other. Good education produced skilled workers who attracted foreign investment, which generated growth and tax revenue that funded more education and infrastructure. Clean government made the business environment attractive, which brought investment and growth that generated resources and reduced the temptation for corruption. Strategic industries policy identified promising sectors and built the infrastructure and skills to support them, creating competitive advantages that attracted more investment. Housing policy created a stable property-owning middle class that supported political stability, which made Singapore attractive for long-term investment. Each element reinforced the others in a virtuous cycle. Breaking into this kind of virtuous cycle is the challenge for developing countries. Singapore had to bootstrap itself, and it was tough. The early years involved sacrifice, with resources poured into investment rather than consumption, with tight discipline imposed on society, with short-term costs accepted for long-term gain. Lee Kuan Yew once said that if Singapore had held a referendum in the 1960s on whether to implement all the policies that eventually made the country successful, the referendum would have failed because people wouldn't have accepted the short-term sacrifices. This raises uncomfortable questions about development and democracy, about whether developing countries can afford the kind of short-term populism that democracies sometimes indulge in. Singapore also benefited from fortunate timing. It industrialized during the era of globalization and rapid growth in international trade, when multinational corporations were expanding into Asia, when there was demand for the kind of labor-intensive manufacturing that Singapore initially offered. The country then upgraded its economy just as global demand for more sophisticated products and services was growing. Whether a country trying to follow Singapore's path today would find the same opportunities in a more competitive, automated, and protectionist global economy is questionable. Looking forward, Singapore faces the challenge of maintaining success, which in some ways is harder than achieving it. The hunger and drive that characterized the early years have inevitably faded as prosperity has become the norm. Younger Singaporeans who have grown up in wealth don't have the same existential fear that motivated earlier generations. Complacency is a real risk. The government constantly warns against it, reminding Singaporeans that their success isn't guaranteed, that competition is intense, that advantages can be lost quickly. Whether this message continues to resonate with a population that has known only success remains to be seen. There's also the question of whether Singapore's political system can evolve without losing its effectiveness. The PAP's dominance has been crucial to policy continuity and long-term planning, but it has also created problems of groupthink, lack of accountability, and limited political participation. As the population becomes more educated and demanding, maintaining the current system may become more difficult. The challenge is whether Singapore can evolve toward a more open, participatory system while maintaining the effective governance and strategic planning that drove its success. This is the central political question facing Singapore in the coming decades. Economically, Singapore needs to continue upgrading and finding new sources of growth. The traditional pillars of manufacturing, port operations, and financial services remain important but face increasing competition and technological disruption. Singapore is betting heavily on new areas like biotechnology, clean energy, digital economy, and advanced manufacturing. Whether these bets pay off, and whether Singapore can transition successfully to an innovation-driven economy will determine whether the country maintains its economic leadership. Socially, Singapore needs to address inequality, maintain social cohesion in an increasingly diverse and stratified society, and manage tensions around immigration and national identity. The compact between government and people, where Singaporeans accepted political constraints in exchange for prosperity and security, may need to be renegotiated for a new generation with different expectations. How Singapore navigates these social changes while maintaining the harmony that has been crucial to its success is a major challenge. Internationally, Singapore must continue its balancing act between major powers, maintain its position as a neutral hub and trusted partner, and adapt to a changing global order where the rules-based system that benefited Singapore may be weakening. The country's influence is limited by its size, but its diplomatic skill, strategic position, and economic importance give it some leverage. Using that leverage effectively while avoiding being caught in conflicts between larger powers requires constant attention and skill. In conclusion, Singapore's transformation from a poor, resourceless colonial outpost to one of the world's wealthiest countries is one of the most remarkable stories in modern economic history. It's a story of visionary leadership that made hard choices and stuck to long-term plans. It's a story of pragmatic policies that prioritized results over ideology. It's a story of massive investment in people, infrastructure, and institutions. It's a story of strategic positioning and effective exploitation of geographic advantages. It's a story of clean governance and effective administration. It's a story of openness to the world and willingness to learn and adapt. But it's also a story that involved trade-offs, particularly between prosperity and political freedom, that remain controversial. Singapore shows that development is possible even in very difficult circumstances, that small countries can thrive in a globalized world, and that effective governance and smart policies can overcome tremendous disadvantages. At the same time, Singapore's experience shows that development is hard, requiring sustained effort, strategic thinking, capable leadership, and often difficult choices. There's no simple formula that other countries can copy, but there are principles and approaches that can be adapted to different contexts. As Singapore enters its sixth decade of independence, the city-state continues to evolve, facing new challenges while building on the remarkable achievements of the past 50-plus years. The story of how Singapore became richer than 95% of countries is still being written, and the next chapters will determine whether this success can be maintained and built upon for future generations.